Welcome to City Works, a co-production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Every month here on City Works, we explore the challenges and lived experiences of working people on the job, at home, and in our communities. Since Inauguration Day, the Trump administration has taken a flurry of measures against organized labor and the right to engage in collective action. At risk is nothing less than the economic security of tens of millions of unionized workers across this country. These are perilous times for sure, yet labor scholars say organized labor is in a better position to fight back than at any time in the past 40 years. Today, 70% of Americans approve of unions, and a large majority of Americans have sided with unions in their recent strikes. 60 million workers, about half of non-union workers, say they would join a union today if they could. The working class has also been ravaged by inflation, declining standards of living, and even dropping life expectancy, and many workers are simply fed up. Here in the nation's labor capital, the fight is led by the New York City Central Labor Council, the nation's largest regional labor federation, representing more than 1 million workers. Their newly elected president is Brendan Griffith, and he joins us here today. Also joining us to talk about the state of the labor movement, especially here in New York City, is David Unger, a longtime local organizer and labor educator. Thank you both for joining us. I truly appreciate having you with us because it seems like we are overdue for a sort of review of where things stand. As we're speaking, we're at the end of March of 2026. If you look back to what you were worried about as the Trump administration was coming into office with their Project 2025 plans, what's been real, what's come to pass, and what perhaps was sort of feint or fear tactics on the Trump administration's part?
Sure. Well, first, Laura, thank you so much for having me. Great to be here with you. I think what we've seen from the Trump administration in some ways is worse than what we anticipated. It's happening faster. There has really just been a decimation of public institutions, those that are meant to protect workers in terms of health and safety, in terms of workplace rights. We've seen attacks on unions. We've seen attacks on immigrant communities. And what we see is this really palatable fear that people have in some ways, from literally stepping outside of their door. And what we need to do is really make sure that the labor movement is positioned, as you said, to take advantage of, within this context of a challenge, there is an opportunity. And we in the labor movement are looking at this and saying, how do we build worker power? How do we show people that they can push back, they can fight back, they can stand up for themselves? Through unions, we can come together and we can say that enough is enough. We're not going to take this.
David, what would you add to that?
Yeah, the speed with which they attempted to implement things and with zero checks and balances, right? The courts aren't actually stopping them. Congress is certainly not doing anything to stop just sort of the speed of attacks and the destruction of the common good and the destruction of public institutions. But I agree with Brendan. It's the approach of authoritarianism and the feeling that people have of being afraid to protest, the glee with which our opposition wants to make violent action against people coming together and defending their rights is scary. It's something that has not been seen in this country in our lifetimes. And it can't help but impact how we think about organizing working people.
Yeah.
And yet we're also seeing people fight back as they have throughout history to when people come after their rights.
In terms of checks and balances, David mentioned, we haven't got many in Washington. What check does the state or city power provide or offer, and is that being used as a sort of check on Trumpian federal authority?
Yeah, I mean, we have a tremendous advocate in City Hall with Mayor Mondami, and the New York City Central Labor Council was proud to endorse him for mayor. What I think is as important as having strong support from the government is understanding that on a local level, on a state level, the people need to push back. There is an aspect of authoritarianism that flourishes because of implied or expressed consent. And I think David alluded to that. What we have is a Congress that has simply given up its power. We have a judiciary that has not done anything to stop some really egregious things that many argue are unconstitutional. The power of people to stand up, to exercise their voices cannot be overstated. And we've seen that in other places around the country as well, in places like Minneapolis, where when there was a tremendous surge of ICE agents, it was the people that stood up and said that this is not acceptable. These are our community members, these are our family and our friends, and we're not going to let this happen. And they were successful in pushing that back. There's a political cost that this administration is going to pay to continue to do this. And we are going to make sure that that cost is severe.
But where are the unions? I mean, I am seeing young people in the streets, whether it's Minneapolis or looking back a year to the protests at Columbia around the war in Israel-Palestine. You see some union presence. I remember seeing UAW banners and stuff. That goes back decades, of course. But are unions using this moment to make themselves a visible part of this sort of foment? There's millions in the streets for the No Kings rallies. Unions are there, but not necessarily all that visible. David?
Well, I would argue that the answer is no, of course not enough, and we've always been there. And so, it's not a yes or no. Going back in New York to Black Lives Matter protests and through Mike Brown and George Floyd, the unions were there.
Yeah.
Both union members individually and some institutionally. A lot of times, unfortunately, in some ways, they were there without their union hat on. They were there not necessarily expressly saying, I'm here because I understand this is the labor movement issue.
Yeah.
If Brendan just talked about the fight back in Minneapolis, the fight back in Minneapolis would not have been so successful if it hadn't been for years and years of work bringing together the unions and the community organizations who have experience fighting together. The Minneapolis Labor Council, together with SEIU Local 26 and CETUR, the Centro de Trabajadores Unidos en la Lucha, who pulled off the organized strikes with many others, and I'm not trying to leave any out.
Right.
All of that actually helped set the conditions necessary. One, it's part of what I think drove the right wing crazy and to choose to send and attack Minneapolis was because there was some organized resistance already there.
Right.
But it also set the conditions where people were able to fight back in an organized way.
Yeah.
Just like we can track back to some of the earliest organizers in the Ferguson uprising had experience striking as fast food workers, right? This isn't separate fights, and the labor movement needs to be more front and center in it, and the labor movement needs to figure out how to make itself even more of a bulwark.
I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too, Brendan, because it is true that Minneapolis was a poor target for the Trump administration, although there are some that say it was the reason that it was the target was because of its broad cross-constituency organizing base that had been so effective just a few years back in passing a full slate of progressive legislation around wages and reproductive justice and non-discrimination and trans rights, all, the gamut, and environment, childcare. As you look at, you mentioned the Mamdani administration, which also has a broad agenda. There seems to be all sorts of opportunity to bring together a coalition like that. Is it happening?
Yeah, and I think it absolutely is happening. I mean, union members are not only union members; they are members of their communities. They are, many are proud immigrants. Many are proud people of faith. And bringing these communities together to show that there is comprehensive power in New York City, that we are not solely one thing, I think is tremendously important, and that is happening. And we're seeing that in demonstrations like No Kings. We have May Day coming up. There are a number of times where people are coming to the streets, and it's not. And I completely agree with David to say that. Labor could play a larger role, and I think in any and all ways, we can say that. That is not to say that labor is not playing a large role, but if you look at a lot of these demonstrations, there are a number of union members there, and there are a lot of people who seem not to be affiliated with unions at all, but they see this as a place that it's important for them to be.
Well, that's where it seems the unions need to come. It's so important that they come in because. There is people power in the streets. Isn't it great? We'll probably have 20 million, you know, before we're done showing up for these No Kings rallies. But if they're not organized into power, then how do they actually exert power beyond protest power? Unions are the best vehicle, historically speaking.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing are a lot of people, and to your point, the 70% of people in this country that support unions, you know, that Gallup poll is really important. It doesn't change the fact that, you know, that union density has struggled, and that 10% of people in this country are in unions. There is that tremendous gap that structurally it needs to be fixed based on labor law on a federal level, based on any number of things, and once again, fear. You know, I think one of the real challenges for the labor movement now is that the attacks are certainly coming from the federal government, but not just from the federal government. You know, the labor movement in and of itself has always been a movement that is there for conflict, to be quite honest, right? We are there because employers are going to try and make money, you know, at the expense of workers, and you know, whether that is the financial expense or their safety, and that has not gone away. You know, the idea of collective bargaining, the idea of the fight existing in the workplace continues, and in fact, I would argue is even worse now because employers are emboldened by what they're hearing from Washington, D.C. So unions are having to double down on some of the contract fights that have always been a fight, but you know, I think the NYSNA strike is a good example of that, where
New York Nurses Association.
Yes, yeah, the New York State Nurses Association strike most recently is a good example of that, where there was an employer who might not have taken this tact, you know, 4 years ago or 3 years ago, but I think what they're seeing in Washington, D.C. Says, well, you know what, maybe unions are a little bit more vulnerable now, and I just want to very clearly say that is not the case. That, you know, we are building power in ways that we haven't before. We're creating alliances in ways that we haven't before, and we're going to make sure that working people understand that the labor movement, which they are a part of, is there to fight back and to ensure that the ability to earn a living is maintained in the city of New York.
Well, I think that's a good moment to take just a little pause, a sobering pause, a humble pause, and when we come back, we will continue this conversation. We're taking a short break. You're watching CityWorks. Welcome back to CityWorks. We're speaking with New York City Central Labor Council President Brendan Griffith and longtime organizer and labor educator David Unger. We're talking about labor's uphill battle in this very moment and in this city. The battle is on in terms of labor power, and we've been talking about the potential in this moment also for labor to not just be, in principle, a sort of people's first option for popular power expression, but in practice. We've seen that in New York recently. You mentioned the struggle of the New York State Nurses Association, the nurses working over there at Brooklyn Hospital. Talk a little bit about what that's been about, how it's played out, and why, in a sense, it's an argument for joining a union.
Sure, yeah, and the New York State Nurses Association, I think what happened at Brooklyn Hospital Center rather, is, you know, emblematic of more significant challenges right now, but it was part of a broader contract fight that they had that led to a strike of 15,000 nurses at 3 different hospitals in Manhattan. Brooklyn Hospital Center was one of those hospitals that I think came to an agreement relatively early in that process. But after that agreement, there was a period of time where, after claiming, you know, financial stress, they stopped providing health benefits to their nurses, which to me is just egregious, absolutely egregious. That those who are entrusted with caring for our loved ones didn't have the ability and the means, no matter how hard they worked and no matter what they did, to care for their own. And through the advocacy of the New York State Nurses Association under President Nancy Higgins, those benefits have been restored. And now the challenge is ensuring that they continue and that Brooklyn Hospital Center doesn't backslide. But, you know, through the voice of their union, these nurses were able to rise up and say that, once again, this is unacceptable. The idea of an employer to be able to unilaterally just change, you know, the benefit package, the compensation for a worker, is terrifying.
Yeah.
The predictability that comes with a union contract, that structure, that the idea that next paycheck is going to come is so tremendously important, especially in a city where workers are, it's harder and harder for workers to survive. It's harder and harder to deal with the lack of affordability in so many ways. I really commend NYSNA for their advocacy, and I know that they are a tremendous, tremendous union out there fighting for their members.
And they're out there all across the country. David, you talked earlier about Minneapolis, and it was the NNU chapter right there in Minneapolis that stood up after the Alex Pretty assassination happened, after the killing of that emergency nurse. It is an example of a place a lot of people who are members of the National Nurses United feel that is their home, that is their organizing activist home. And I know the NYSNA people feel this way too. It has a kind of collective spirit that goes beyond just the negotiations around the workplace. Where else are you seeing that? And how do unions build that sense that isn't just, although strikes are important and contract negotiations are important, but it feels to me that we're needing to get beyond that and creating more of a kind of whole worker organizing of the kind that our friend Jane, the late, much missed Jane McAleave used to talk about.
Well, and I do think that, NYSNA is not a unique case, but
Sure.
It's not the only one. However, there is something quite powerful, right? People who are nurses, who are dedicated to care, and whose union has seen and has accepted for a very long time that their responsibility is to fight for not only what goes on day to day in the workplace, but to help people connect very clearly that impacts everybody else.
Right.
It's not just about nurses. It's about quality of care. It's about every single one of us who has to go to a hospital. It's about me taking my kid this morning to get blood drawn and knowing that we've got nurses there and phlebotomists and everybody who's taking care of them. And I think unions have sometimes struggled to take that holistic look. And we know that there was a large sort of push around questions of bargaining for the common good. But really, I do think that the more unions connect with their members around their entire lives and the importance of their work, the better they do.
Yeah.
Right? The better they do in terms of making people feel like it is their home, as you said, their home for activism.
There was another example in New York recently, Craig, I'd love to come, Brendan, I'd love to come back to you about, was the fight down at the private university, New York University, where the faculty went on a several-day strike. Now, the great thing about NYU, for people that don't know Manhattan, is its place of protest is Washington Square Park, public park in the middle of West Village, super public, surrounded by residents, a whole lot of property owned by the university, but other people too. Talk about what happened there and its significance, or was that just sort of run-of-the-mill contract organizing?
Well, I think that no contract organizing is run-of-the-mill. Each one is of significance to the members who are there trying to fight for the benefits that they deserve and the contract that they deserve. But this I think was unique. We had almost 1,000 faculty that went on strike, and these are non-tenure track faculty. So
you also saw students out there protesting with them and all sorts of people.
Yeah, and the momentum around supporting workers I think is there, right? And as we've been talking about it, it needs to be captured. And this local did a very good job of doing that. These are folks that really make the university run, and they were in and of themselves struggling. People who had been teachers for 10, 15, 20 years at NYU, struggling to make a living, and they said enough is enough. And I think over the 2 days that they were on strike, the university realized how much they needed them. We talk about in the context of the pandemic, we talked about essential workers. For those of us in the labor movement, the idea of an essential worker, that was not a new idea. Right. We've been saying this in so many industries in so many ways for a very long time. But as employers are seeing that workers are willing to withhold their labor and the effects that it has on the institution or the business, they're realizing that value. And I congratulate those workers on the contracts that they got, that they're reviewing. And I think that what they did is they stood up in a way that really is inspiring to other workers, to show that you don't have to take what's simply handed to you and say that, okay, that's all I'm going to get, but you can fight for more. Yeah. And when you do, you can win.
We all accept that a strike is galvanizing, right? Like
Yeah.
there is an idea that sort of every generation of workers has to go on strike in a union if you want to keep the lifeblood of your union going. Now, I do not want to fetishize striking either, because I think there oftentimes is a tendency on the left and sometimes on the labor left about like we just have to strike, right? We have to do deep analysis. We have to do deep organizing. We have to ensure that when we strike, we actually win, not right. There is nothing guaranteed about a win from a strike. But even if it isn't striking, and I think we're seeing this in some ways, the No Kings example on one side, but actions like the UAW is taking, like NICE is taking, right? There is something life changing and that changes both the organization and the individual when you come together to take collective action. And we can't minimize that. And you can't short circuit it. And there kind of isn't anything that replaces it. People have to be moved to take collective action together. And in doing so, things change.
Yeah, beautifully put. I want to ask the two of you how you got involved in unions. Let's start with you, David. You know, as a young person, how did it come to be that you saw your future in a union?
I am both lucky enough and cursed to be the fourth generation in my family to work in the labor movement. Um, just recently, Brendan and I were together at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory commemoration, and my great grandfather was a textile worker, an immigrant who was an organizer with the Amalgamated. And so I grew up on the picket line. I grew up understanding the union difference. I grew up having health care. I grew up with my parents being able to have a house because my parents worked for unions.
Yeah.
And and even then, I had to find my place in my anger on my own, and had to get out and see just how screwed people were, and just and feel that passion and anger, and have been lucky enough to. I mean, you talk about finding your home, your activist home. My activist home for most of my life has been the labor movement. And I've been trained in a holistic version of this labor movement, in that it was with my parents' unions that when I was at 6 years old, we took the union bus at 3 a.m. down to Washington, D.C. for major pro-choice rallies. Right? That wasn't divorced from the labor movement. That was the labor movement standing up for the whole woman and the
Right.
whole person and the whole family.
What about you, Brendan?
You know, while several generations removed, you know, it started with the immigrant story of my grandfather, who, when he came from Ireland, was able to get a job as a bus mechanic and was a proud member of TWU Local 100. That provided him and the opportunity to take care of his family. And my mother was, I believe, an 1199 member first when she was growing up, and then became a teacher. And she was a very proud member of NICET until she retired about 10 years ago. And now she is enjoying a very well-deserved pension and maintains good health care because of what the union was able to provide. So similar to Dave, I had those dinner table conversations about what a union means and the benefit it could be. When I graduated from college, I started an apprenticeship with Iron Workers Local 40, and I did that for a number of years. That was how I made my living. And really what brought me to the Central Labor Council, to make a longer story short, was gratitude. I was very lucky to have the job that I had as an iron worker. It was a good way to make a living. It was a difficult way to make a living. You know, iron workers and folks in construction and so many other jobs, they earn every dollar. But that being the case, I was offered an opportunity, or saw an opportunity rather, to help make bad jobs better and to help people get good jobs. And I wanted to take that so that more people could be provided with the opportunity that I had.
You've mentioned immigration and immigrants in two contexts, your family and also the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, where the workers inside who perished were largely immigrants and who had been blowing the whistle on the dangers in that workplace for years. Unions have been a welcoming place for immigrants recently. Immigrants have joined with more alacrity than others, usually. They often bring a history that some of you, not unlike what you've just shared, of union membership in their home countries and fighting for union rights in their home countries. And they must be very afraid right now. How are your unions addressing that situation?
You know, I think it can be a challenge, to be quite honest, and it's both the the embrace of people coming into unions and ensuring that they feel welcome. At the same time, that vulnerability that you described, that fear, it certainly exists in immigrant communities, and it exists in many others as well. There's a reality that the downward pressure that is being put on people, that the harder and harder it's becoming to earn a living, means that there is this perceived economy of scarcity, which is, to be honest, I think is more a myth than a truth.
Promoted.
But in that context, whether the folks who are coming into unions are immigrants or not, I think that there is a sense that that this pie only has so many pieces, and that's what people in power want us to believe. The reality, I think, is very different, but I think unions are doing a good job of making sure that it is understood that we all deserve to support ourselves and our families. We all deserve to have safe workplaces, as we talked about at the commemoration of the Triangle Fire this week. There is a story, that every union member has that goes back in so many ways in this country to an immigrant that came here. And I think we need to remember that history and apply those lessons to the future. The reality is so many people are just coming here to try and make a better opportunity for themselves and their families.
And if we have enough money to wage war and build ballrooms, I think we can feed and clothe and give health care.
I tend to agree.
Thank you. Brendan Griffith and David Unger. It was wonderful speaking with you both. That is it for CityWorks this time. If you have comments or questions, write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. And if you like what you just saw, consider making a donation, either to CUNY TV or to the School of Labor and Urban Studies Foundation, or both, at the links below. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching.